Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we are extremely delighted to be hosting journalist Julia Ioffe, who's here to talk about her fascinating and captivating new book, Motherland, A Feminist History of Modern Russia from Revolution to Autocracy. This is really a blend of a book. It's part history and part memoir. The history tells the story of Russia over the past century or so, but through the women who lived and shaped it. While the memoir tells the story of 4 generations of remarkable women in Julia's own family. Julia was 7 years old when, in 1990, she and her family left the Soviet Union for the United States, but she's maintained a deep interest in Russia, returning there initially on a Fulbright in 2009, and then ending up staying 3 years and reporting for the New Yorker magazine and Foreign Policy. She has since served as a senior editor for the New Republic and written for the Atlantic, Politico, and GQ magazine. Currently, she's a Washington correspondent for Puck, a digital media company that she co-founded. 2 of Julia's great-grandmothers were doctors. Another had a PhD in chemistry and ran her own lab. And one of her grandmothers oversaw the plant that supplied the Kremlin's drinking water. In the context of US history, she writes, these women might be considered exceptional, but in their own country, they were perfectly average people. Because when the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, they embarked on a campaign to erase gender distinctions, granting freedoms and rights to Soviet women that took decades to occur in the West. The right to vote, the right to abortion, right to no-fault divorce, and so on. These moves to eliminate legal, educational, and social differences between the sexes led to many opportunities for women who worked and fought alongside men in Soviet society. But in time, the trends reversed and led to a present-day Russia estranged from its previous pioneering ethos of gender egalitarianism, a Russia where, as Julia put it, women are more focused on attracting male and preferably rich partners and being stay-at-home moms. Now, Julia sets out in her book to explore how this change happened. She brings together the stories of her own female relatives with those of many other Soviet women, some prominent, others ordinary citizens whose accounts are preserved in memoirs, interviews, and oral histories. The result's an illuminating fresh take on Russia's turbulent past century and its shifting gender politics. In conversation with Julia will be another journalist, Sabrina Tavernise, who also reported from Russia, starting in the mid-1990s for such publications as Business Week and Bloomberg News, and later for the New York Times, which she joined in 2000. She went on to report from Turkey and Pakistan and such conflict zones as Iraq and Ukraine. She's now she has one of the best titles in journalism. We were just talking about this. She's now a national writer at large for the New York Times. How many of you would love to be writers at large at anything? Anyway, please join me in welcoming Julia and Sabrina.
Thank you. I do actually have that title. Lucky me. I'm going to have my phone here on my lap because this is where my questions are. I'm not looking at my email, but I figured I'd warn you guys. Thank you so much for coming out. This is a really, really big honor for me because this is Julia's big day. The book came out today, so you guys have perfect timing. I had the honor of reading the book early. And I did it over my vacation, and it was weirdly, I just kept reading, and I kind of couldn't stop, which I wasn't expecting that with a nonfiction book, after all, was not a novel, and I was on vacation. And I finished the last page of the last chapter in an airport in Germany, and I found myself weeping. And I kind of was surprised at that. And I wrote Julia a message and I said, "I'm just finished your book, and I am so overwhelmed because it really captures so beautifully the sweep and the pain of the 20th century in this country that we both really love, and we both really hurt for, and we both have strived to understand. But at the same time, it also had this indomitable spirit of these women who were kind of your main characters and at the core of kind of how the place kept together. You know, they were the glue that like allowed the place to keep going every day. And I don't know how many of you here, I'm looking at Julia's parents over here on the left. Many of you here, or perhaps some of you here, have been to Russia, and those who have know that, you know, when you travel to kind of provincial towns, you often find towns made mostly of women. You know, women are, they have the important jobs because they are the ones who can be trusted. They're the bus drivers. They are the mine shaft operators. They're the air traffic controllers. And, you know, women have this very kind of, you know, important and special place in Russia. And it just struck me that, like, I just loved that Julia decided that this was how she wanted to tell the story of this country, because it's, you don't often kind of, you know, see big pictures through the people who aren't the ones typically who are seen to be making the history. But I thought this was just such a wonderful, original idea and way to kind of approach Russia's charming disaster of the 20th century. A little 1 minute about me. Sorry, I'm going to just tell you this small story. So I'm, as was said, a reporter for the New York Times. I have spent a lot of years of my career in war zones, and as you know we're being recorded, but at the New York Times, very competitive, and there are a lot of. I was the only female in a bureau of all men, and they usually wanted to do the important story, which was, you know, military military operations, going around with American troops, you know, riding around on American tanks. That was what the guys wanted to do, and I said I was going to do something different. I was going to go into families and talk to women and figure out kind of how were they living their lives. How do you get a kid to school when you have, a militia kind of guarding a territory? How do you bring a wedding cake from A to B in a city that's like has 1 million checkpoints? And what I found was actually the central story of the war, which was that there was a sectarian cleansing going on and kind of killing large swaths of different neighborhoods that I would only have seen had I gone into people's houses and been talking to the women. So I want to say Julia has done something incredibly important, which is she actually saw the story of what was going on in a different way. And sometimes when you go to those places and you talk to the women and find out how they have kind of experienced the thing, you learn something that's very important and that perhaps is the central story. So with that, I want to ask Julia how you kind of came to this idea and decided to do this book.
Well, first, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to Sabrina. I just want to say that, and I said this to Sabrina backstage, but when we were all baby reporters in Moscow, Sabrina's not much older, but Sabrina's, and I didn't overlap with you in Moscow, but when I arrived, the legend of Sabrina Tavernise just reigns supreme in Moscow, and we all wanted to be like Sabrina. And I wish I could go back in time, like 15 years, and say, hey, when your book comes out about Russia, because yes, you're going to write a book about Russia, you're going to do the launch event with Sabrina. And baby Julia would have probably fainted. So thank you. This is a huge honor for me. Basically, the idea for the book was, it started in 2017 during Russiagate, And I was constantly, again, on TV or in my job being asked, what does Vladimir Putin want? What does Vladimir Putin think? What is Vladimir Putin going to do next? Which is a fair question in an authoritarian regime where he is really the only decision maker. And I was just so fucking sick of it. Sorry. And I just didn't want to write about Vladimir Putin anymore. I knew I wanted to write about Russia, but I didn't want to write about him. I felt like he had taken up enough of my time, enough of Russians' time, and I was sick of him living rent-free in my brain. So part of that was an experiment in how do I tell the story of Russia without Putin? And then it was like, how do I tell the story of Russia not without Putin or without Stalin, but around them, where they are kind of background characters, where they're the weather, and the protagonists are the women. And then, two things happened. One was Gail Ross, my agent, who's in the audience, kept saying, these women in your family are so extraordinary, you need to write a book about them. I was like, it's going to be a 20-page book. I don't know what else to say. Because I had friends in Russia who were close to the Solzhenitsyn, who were, famous dissidents, who were, the sons and daughters of famous Soviet, I almost said action figures, historical figures. And my family was like average. They were lovely, extraordinary people to me, but not in the world historical sense. And then I realized that to explain why was something that seemed extraordinary to an American, but was ordinary to a Russian, how to explain that gap, you actually needed a 500-page book. Because you needed to go all the way back to the 19th century. And then the third part of the idea actually came from Nina Khrushcheva, Nikita Khrushchev's great-granddaughter, although she's technically both his granddaughter and great-granddaughter. Ask me later. But I was interviewing her about her grandmother, Nikita's wife. And she was like, have you noticed that the fate of the first ladies, I mean, the Soviet Union didn't really have first ladies, but the women who were married to the leaders, that their fate always reflected the fate of the country at large. And I realized that would be the kind of the narrative structure, that the women who, Stalin's two wives, Lenin's wife, Khrushchev's wife, Gorbachev's wife, Putin's now ex-wife, that they would be the vehicle for telling the big history. And my family and other ordinary Soviets would be the people who, in Svetlana Alexievich's words, would be the little people who told us what it felt like to live through the history. So, and that's why it's 500 pages, because I was like trying to do all of that in one book.
So it is 500 pages, but I found some of the most interesting and surprising stuff, and perhaps it's because I knew it the least well, to be the very beginning stuff. I mean, the revolution, the idea that we think of the Russian Revolution as this, grand experiment in kind of how society should be organized, and we mostly think of it as an economics kind of labor thing. But it was also a radical feminist experiment. And I liked kind of you bringing us into the world of those women characters and kind of what they were after. Tell us a little bit about those characters, and why you decided to start there.
Well, I decided to start there because I was like, wait, how did this happen? How did the extraordinary become ordinary? And I kept, peeling the onion, and was trying to find the germ of these ideas in Russia. But really, in the book, you're learning along with me, because I was writing as I was learning. I studied Soviet history in college. I've studied and written about the place for 20 years. I didn't know about these women at all. I had never heard of them. I'd heard of Krupskaya, Lenin's wife, who was in charge of the fight against illiteracy, who is a big educational theorist, but I had never heard of any of these women. And so you're learning you're learning how I learned about them and figuring out how they, create their ideas, created the society. The stuff they wrote, the stuff they pushed for sounds radical even now. And they were saying this at the turn of the 20th century, over 100 years ago.
Give us an example or two.
So an example was that childbearing should be seen as a social good, that women need to be supported. If we want women to have children, we need to support them in doing that. All of society, all of government needs to pay for this, for individual women to have children. That means childcare, that means help with cooking, with laundry, with transportation. The idea that women should work and parent the way men do, that you go and you spend most of your creative energy on your work. And then you come home and you say, oh my God, you're so cute, off to bed with you, right? and somebody else does the dirty work of the dishes and the diapers and the hard work of child rearing. Lenin said, it's also inefficient to have 1 million women slaving away in 1 million stinky kitchens. Another of Kollontái's ideas, Alexandra Kollontai was a revolutionary, a comrade in arms of Vladimir Lenin. She had radical ideas about women's pleasure, about love, about sex. And she said, look, the most important thing in a woman's life is her work. And if she falls in love, she can go and drink from that cup until she's sated and then say, that was nice. I'm going back to the thing that actually gives my life meaning and purpose as a person, which is my work.
In the very beginning of the 20th century.
She wrote that in 1913. And of course, it was very quickly turned on its head and weaponized by them. You'll be shocked to learn that the men didn't take kindly to these ideas, that women were very quickly, the Bolsheviks were incredibly egalitarian when they were in the underground, right? When their ideas didn't really have any practical import, right? They were just fighting amongst themselves these ideological battles, and they were incredibly egalitarian. The second they got power, they were like, okay, the men are in charge now. And the women got, at the top, became fewer and fewer and further between. And the men in charge were like, okay, that free love thing, don't know about that. And we need everybody to work. So in 1920, the Soviet Union legalized abortion and said everybody, men and women, have to work full time. And of course, for them, it wasn't that important to think about who looks after the kids, the nurseries, the cafeterias that they promised to build, the state laundromats they promised to build. Like, they were busy doing important things like war and industry. They of course very quickly abandoned these ideas without, by the way, abandoning this idea that women still had to work. So what ended up happening is women were working full time, they were keeping house full time, and they were being mothers full time. And as the historian Greta Booker said, they performed each of these jobs as if it were her sole job.
Mm-hmm. You wrote about violence against women, domestic abuse, and I'm curious. I want you to just tell us a little bit about kind of what you found there, and why was it salient for you, kind of as part of the story? Like, what did it say about? When did it happen? Was there kind of a pattern to it, and what did it say about the society?
So in 2017, I believe Russia decriminalized domestic violence. I was still traveling to Russia on and off for work. And again, I was busy reporting stories that were assigned to me by male editors here in the US, which was, what does Vladimir Putin want? So this stuff kind of...
It all goes back to that.
It all goes back to that. And like, what's important? The economy, the military, the big politics. And this story kind of just flew by me. But more and more of my female friends in Russia were talking about this, and more of these crazy stories kept cropping up. A woman whose husband chops off her hands, a professor of history at St. Petersburg State University who kills his lover in a really crazy way, and then planned, if he hadn't been arrested, had planned to dress up as Napoleon, which was his historical specialty, and then commit suicide very theatrically. And my friends kept drawing my attention to it, and I was like, I'm busy writing about Putin. And I couldn't understand it. Like, what is the point of decriminalizing domestic violence? Like, why go out of your way to do that? That is just so weird, and I couldn't understand it. And so again, part of that those chapters in the book is me trying to figure out why they did that. And it came down to two things. The first was, and stop me if this sounds familiar, the women are succeeding more than the men in education, at work. They're so strong and independent, and they're leaving the men behind, and the men are lonely and sad. And we have to help the men. The women will be fine. We have to help the men. And men going to jail for, a slap, that's just going to destroy the family. And we're trying to keep the family together. We're all about traditional family values. This is the basis, the building block of Russian society. And we need women to have more babies, right? We need women to have lots more babies, and we need the men to stay for that. So it was part of this discourse about the crisis of masculinity that was happening in Russia again, but this time in like 2016, 2017. And the second part was the country was becoming more and more and more authoritarian, and there was less and less and less space for dissent, for protest, for journalism, for independent thinking. And men were being asked to be very masculine in the most cartoonish way, but they weren't allowed to self-actualize at work. They were, because the economy was kind of flatlining, or not flatlining, stagnating, and their discontent couldn't go up the chain. So they needed a steam valve. And that steam valve was their wives and their girlfriends, and letting them take that frustration out on them so it doesn't bubble over and reach the top. And when I was, the women who were working on this, the lawyers, the activists, the journalists, they were like, this smells bad. This smells like kerosene. This can only lead to more and more and more violence. This is getting society used to violence at the earliest level. As one of these lawyers who represented a lot of these domestic violence victims, who said, we can't really do anything for them now because the system doesn't protect them. So what we do is we chase the guy so he doesn't have time to chase her. So we just tie him up in court with petitions and hearings that we know we won't win, but at least he'll be too busy to chase her and kill her. And she was like, look, it's all about accustoming people to violence. Because if you're telling people that, look, mom hit me, dad hit mom, they hit each other, they hit me, what's the big deal? Right? And then it's like, oh, the police hit me, what's the big deal? Oh, we have to go kill Ukrainians, what's the big deal? And what was so scary to me about that was that these women had been sounding the alarm, that this kind of, this rhetoric about masculinity and crisis and how it has to be channeled out into traditionalism and pampering men and allowing them to be violent toward women, that this leads to a place of total societal violence. And then a few years later, we get the full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Another one chapter that really shocked me and was, I feel like, quite arresting, a little bit on these lines, and also to the point of what women see that many people, that the broader society may not. You had a chapter about Lavrent Beria, and he, an early Soviet Stalin deputy, basically, very, very perpetrated a lot of violence.
He was the head of the NKVD, or the NKVD, then the MGB, which became the KGB, and then the FSB. He was the head of the Soviet nuclear program. He was the second most powerful person in the Soviet Union after Stalin.
Thank you. Sorry. Bumbling around about something Soviet, something. But you had a very interesting exchange with your grandmother as you were walking in Moscow. Tell us about that, and tell us why you decided to kind of do a chapter on that. I'm backing up a little bit, so this is now earlier Soviet history, but Julia's going to tell us.
So it's basically the same. I mean, it's the same story over and over again in the book that I think you've hit on perfectly, and that we are conditioned to do as journalists, even as women journalists. I was walking through Moscow with my grandmother, to whom the book is dedicated, and she was like, "Oh yeah, that's Beria's house," and it was like across the garden ring. And it was the Tunisian embassy now. And I was like, okay. And she was like, yeah, all of us girls knew to take the long way around that house. And I was like, why? And she's like, what do you mean why? Because he snatched girls off the street, took them back there, and raped them. And we all knew to avoid it. And I was like, okay, whatever. Because again, I was busy writing about Putin. And I was busy writing about Navalny, and I was busy writing about the things that the men take seriously, and so we have to take seriously. And I never pulled on that thread until I sat down to write the book. And I think my grandmother had died by then. And as it turned out, Beria's one of his main, I don't want to call her a mistress, like sex slave, whom he impregnated at 16. I'm like, I found one of her boyfriends and talked, and then I found out that she had been alive when I lived in Moscow. It wasn't that hard to find one of her boyfriends and talk to him. I could have found her. I could have talked to her about what it was like to have been snatched off the street at 16 by the second most powerful person in the Soviet Union, who oversaw the secret police in the Gulag and told you and raped you, took away your virginity, and said, if you breathe a word of this to anybody, you and your entire family will end up in the Gulag at best. And then she was essentially pressed into his service, and he impregnated her. And she was 17 when she went into labor. This former boyfriend of hers told me. And Beria called her while she was in the hospital, and he said, I'll give you anything you want. And because she was still a kid herself, she asked for a bicycle. And I couldn't, I was so mad at myself that I didn't pull on these threads.
I mean, the story of Beria just strikes me as it is absolute power, and like how deeply it corrupts. I mean, because he did this with many girls.
He did this with many, and as I researched this, I realized everybody knew about this. It had been widely talked about. My father knew about it. My grandfather knew about it. The men knew about it. Because there were famous actresses and singers that he got this way. And they'd say, I can't, I'm married. And he's like, no problem. And has their husband arrested and shot, or arrested and disappeared into the Gulag. Because he was the head of the entire Soviet penal system, I mean, by the time he was arrested and tried in secret and shot in 1953, over 20 million Soviets had been through the Gulag. So that's a huge fraction, and the rest of them are scared shitless, right, to not end up there because they know somebody who's disappeared. And so he uses this power for this. And women who write to him about their husbands who have disappeared and said, hey, I don't know what happened to my husband. Can you please help me find them? He had his people look into whether this woman was pretty or not. If she was pretty, he'd summon her on the pretense of saying, I'm going to help you, and then rape her and tell her, if you breathe a word of this to anybody, you're going to the Gulag too, and your parents and your children. This is what the other men, and again, what was stunning is everybody knew about this. The men, the women, but I couldn't find it anywhere in the history books. It was always this kind of prurient footnote. And when I asked male historians about this, they were just like, oh, we don't really know anything about it. And it's kind of like the implication was that it was kind of gross and salacious gossip. And to ask about it was to not be serious. And like, oh, we don't know where the evidence is. And a lot of the witnesses are dead. And it's like, well, you guys were writing the history when they were
Right.
still alive and the archives were still open. Why? You know?
Yeah, it was it was a sobering chapter. Lyudmila Putina. Another amazing chapter of this book is Putin's wife, first wife, now ex-wife, and how they courted and how he treated her. I mean, it was very revealing, I thought, about this man that everybody wants to know about. Sorry to bring it back to Vladimir Putin, but tell us a little bit about her.
Yeah, I decided to tell his story like Stalin's, like Lenin's, through his wife, his first wife. And this was a hard chapter to research because guess what? Nobody wants to talk about this. And I found there was one book that came out 2 years into Putin's interminable presidency. And Lyudmila Putina, his then wife, sat for hours of interviews with this guy because this was an authorized biography. And she was not happy. She was pissed at her position. She was mad that Putin agreed to become the caretaker president and then the president without talking to her at all. He didn't even tell her this was going to happen. She found out from a friend. Like she didn't even know to turn on the TV to see Putin say like, hey, I'm your caretaker president now. And you could see that all of this stuff had built up, all this resentment, and she shared it all with this writer. So the book gets published in 2002, and it's supposed to be the first volume, and there's no second volume. And I don't think this guy has written anything since. I don't know where he is. This book is impossible to find. It doesn't exist. Like you can get any book, any Russian book, pirated 17 different ways online. You can download it for free anywhere. I couldn't find this book anywhere, even the pirated digital copy. I found one old copy on Amazon for $200. It had originally been like $3, right? And in this, we see Putin at home. And you'll be shocked to know that he is a total asshole. He was not very nice to his first girlfriend, then fiance, then wife. He was late to every single date. We know now that's his signature power move. He made the Pope wait 45 minutes. He made the Queen wait. The first person he made to wait was his wife when she was his girlfriend. He was an hour and a half late to every single date. And she, being a good Russian woman, showed up on time every time and was like, maybe this time. And years later, she was like, I really should have brought a book. Like that was the lesson she learned. And she still thought, he decided they would take up downhill skiing in Leningrad, which is built on a swamp. It would be like taking up downhill skiing in Washington, D.C. And so they went downhill skiing every weekend, 2 hours away. It used up all her money, all her free time. He treated her like a servant. And when they got married and they had their first child, she decided she wanted to name the girl Natasha. And she called him from the maternity hospital and said, I want to name her Natasha. And he said, nope, we're going to name her after my mother, Maria. And she was like, yeah, so that's what we had to do. And what's crazy is that she, like so many Russian women, thought he was a catch. That all of this, he was also just this withholding asshole to her. Like there's these parts that are agonizing to read. So they moved to Dresden in 1985. And the kind of den mother of the KGB, station there, Yevgenia Timofeyevna makes sure that none of the women work and that they create the right conditions for their husbands to work. That means 3 hot meals a day from scratch, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, all the housework by hand. You have to take care of the kids, etc. And Luda was trying so hard because she knew her boss, like the den mother, was a good cook. She was always trying to cook tasty things for Volodya Putin. And he just refused to compliment her. Like she would try this and she would try that. And she said at best he would say, not bad. And if he didn't like something, he would just move the dish away from himself. He would just sit in front of the television and eat. She would bring him his dish, like his food, then take away the dishes.
He was a grumpy sphinx, in other words.
Was that?
He was a grumpy sphinx.
Yeah. And she, and he would just like move the dish away without saying anything. And she was like, he just refused to say anything nice about my cooking. And so I started to hate cooking. And she was like, I was just so jealous of these women. I'm just saying this as somebody who loves to cook and who has a partner who loves to eat my food. Like that one really hit home. And I was like, what a jerk. But it was just like, yeah, this is the Putin we all know. And what he wants is to demean and dominate and just show that you don't matter compared to him, that his time is the only time that matters. His opinion, his decisions are the only ones that matter.
I'm doing a quick time check. I want to give people a chance to ask questions. So I'm just going to tell you that there's the microphone here. Yep. So if you would like to ask a question, please come to the microphone. Yeah, you want to come up to the microphone?
Thank you so much for being here. I'm actually from Georgia, and I'm so sorry that both Beria and Stalin would produce really terrible men for the Soviet Union.
These were both Georgians.
Gorbachev. My question is related to the war in Ukraine. A lot of people thought that after the war began and the body bags would go back to Russia, the mothers would rise up and actually protest and have really strong voice. Why do you think that didn't happen? Is it because their attitudes changed, or maybe because of the disinformation? Thank you so much.
It's a good question because there are 2 chapters in the book about that. No, I know, but thank you for the perfect tee up. But basically, a lot of women did protest, and they did in these kind of ethnic enclaves in the North Caucasus and Buryatia, which were bearing the brunt of the casualties, right? Because in his war for Ruski Mir, for the Russian kind of nationalist idea, he didn't send blonde Slavic boys to fight. He sent the Buryats, the Chechens, the Dagestanis, the Avars. And when the draft started in September of 2022, a lot of women, a lot of wives and mothers did rise up. They were quickly squashed, right? The protests were squashed. And a lot of them were driven underground or into just abandoning this. There are some women who were happy to see, kind of export their men to the war because these men lie on the couch and drink, beat them, don't bring their salary home if they're working, right? And it was like the salaries that the Russian army has been offering are 10, 15 times what you can make on average in these regions. And that's before you get the bonuses and before you get the payouts if you're injured or that your family gets if you're killed. And there were a lot of women who were like, you know, there was this amazing video from Donetsk where they gathered these war widows
in eastern Ukraine.
Yeah, and gave them fur coats from a store in Moscow. And you should see this video. These women are so happy. Like they at least got fur coats out of their dead husbands. Like they at least got something for dealing with these, you know, trash men. And then, of course, it turned out once the cameras were off, they took back the fur coats and left for Moscow. There was a real estate blogger who went on a podcast, and she was asked, so if you're a woman and you're in your 20s, how do you buy your first apartment? And she said, well, marry a guy, have him sign up for the military. He'll eventually get killed. You'll get the payout, and you buy an apartment. She got in a lot of trouble for that and had to apologize. But, you know, women are not a monolith. as you know, and some women fought for their men to be returned from the front. There are some who were happy to send them off to die because that would be far more useful. And then, but more fundamentally, I found this question that I had started asking. I was like, wait, why is it on the women to save everybody? They didn't start the war. They didn't send in the tanks. They're not the ones doing the fighting, but why do they have to save everybody again?
I would just add that a colleague of mine at the Times, who's until recently been going back and forth to Russia still and still gets visas. Valerie, yeah. Valerie Hopkins, very brave reporter. She spent some time near the Kazakh border on the Russian side. So to your question, and her question was the same. She went to a funeral for a guy, I think in his 50s, from an ethnic minority. And they said basically, you know, we haven't had any economic life here basically since the Soviet collapse. And his two brothers had both committed suicide in the past several years, or I don't remember exactly what the timing was, but she basically, the sister was making the point that, like, you know, at least we get money from this one. So it's a very actually bone sad story because as Julia says, you know, it's not white Russians in Moscow. It's ethnic minorities who have so much less power and so much less money and so much less ability to really have any agency.
Well, and who are subject to constant discrimination, who are then being asked to do the fighting and the dying to spread this Slavic Christian nationalism to Russianness to Ukraine. The other thing I'll say about that is I tell this story of a woman named Maria Andreeva whose husband gets drafted, and basically at every point she's trying to save him from himself, and he's just like, no, I'm going to make it worse. And that's also, to me, the story of Russia over and over again, where the men are just like, I'm going to drink and drive, and I'm going to start a war, and I'm going to start massive political repressions. And then it's like, oh, man, we really did a number on the country. Somebody has to rebuild and repopulate it, and that's going to be the women. And that's also the leitmotif of the book, which is the women, on top of everything else they're being asked to do, have to carry this country on their back and try to save it from itself, which doesn't seem very fair. Hey, Annie.
Hi, how are you? Hearing you talk about the wives made me think of Melania Trump while I was listening to you talk. And she recently held a very rare event at the White House where she made a big announcement that she had a back channel with Putin and reunited 8 children with the Ukrainian families. I did not know what to make of this story. Like, is that a big deal? Is it real? Is she back channeling with Putin? Like, I just didn't know. Should I be taking this very seriously as great news? So I wanted to know what you thought of that, and especially of the Melania-Putin relationship, given that you're talking so much about women and especially like wives of. Yeah.
That's Annie Carney, the New York Times congressional correspondent and total badass, by the way. Yeah, so I wrote about this in Puck last week, that basically this is a really smart move by Putin. Trump had said that, hey, every time I talk to Putin, he tells me really nice things, and then I come home and the first lady says, oh yeah, I'm sure he said nice things to you, but he bombed another Ukrainian city today, right? And at first I thought, okay, he's just making up. This is like, oh, a guy told me that I'm the best, and you know. And then we learned in Anchorage that Melania asked Trump to pass Putin a letter about the Ukrainian children. And I thought, okay, well, so clearly this is actually a thing that's happening, that Melania is in Trump's ear saying, like, don't trust this guy. And so Melania came out and said, hey, this whole time I've had a back channel with Putin, and he was actually very helpful. And he and very forthcoming, and he provided a lot of information to me on these children that all checked out. And we got 8 kids reunited with their families, including one that was reunited with her family that was now in Russia. And, you know, all of a sudden she wasn't talking about these children being kidnapped, of being cleansed of their Ukrainian identity, of being separated from their families. She was just talking about them being displaced. And she wasn't talking about the ICC warrant out for Putin's arrest for specifically this, for the kidnapping of Ukrainian children. She was suddenly taking on this kind of very, like, oh, this just happened and Putin's helping me fix this. And all he had to do was get 8 children released, right? Out of 20,000, my dad points out. Yeah. So, smart move.
Thanks, Dad.
Thanks, Dad.
So, full disclosure, I'm not a reporter for the New York Times. Probably one of the few people in the room that has no press
Me neither.
credentials. So, I'd like to say, my first time hearing you live speak, you're a great storyteller. And I would imagine your parents are very proud of you today.
Are you? No pressure.
So my question really is about kind of the historical swings between revolution and counter-revolution in terms of women's history, specifically linking Chairman Mao's saying of women hold up half the sky and kind of paralleling that with the Russian Revolution and where both countries ended up. Is there any connection there?
So that's an excellent question. Unfortunately, I am quite ignorant about China. I know that that Chairman Mao said this, and they had their own kind of path toward emancipating women after a fashion. I think Russia swings from extreme to extreme. Russia has this constant identity crisis about what is it. I think a lot of countries do. I think this country does as well. But to see it, as you said, through its women, at least gave me a very interesting, like I had read all about the purges, and about the Gulag, but to read it from the point of view of the women's side of the fence opened up a whole new Gulag for me. That sounds terrible. But yeah, I mean, Russia wanted both, right? It wanted women to work and be productive members because it needed the labor, but it also needed them to have babies because they needed more workers and more soldiers, and they needed them to do both of these things as if it were their full-time job. And women, without much support from the state, and women eventually got incredibly tired of this and said, "We just want a break." At which point Gorbachev comes in 1987 and says, I'm going to return women to their purely feminine mission of being wives and mothers, which sounded great, except that it was a nice cover for the painful economic reforms he had to do and to cut, because there was full employment in the Soviet Union and everybody was employed by the government. And he was going to cut the employment roles. The idea was to cut the women and save the jobs for the men. And that was the initial swing. But turns out the Soviet Union was broke and collapsed and left a broke, chaotic country in its stead. And women couldn't just return to their purely feminine mission of having kids. They had to work because there was hunger, economic chaos, and again, then that created even more of an appetite for this traditional model where men are men, women are women, and the men are in charge. So, I don't know, maybe another swing in the other direction is coming, but I'm not hopeful.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'm not a journalist either, more like a military analyst. However, I wonder, and my question doesn't pertain to any of the women in your story, but you did allude to, Putin's history, etc. Nobody ever talks about his presence in possibly the Afghan war or ever having had, as a young KGB officer, any part of that. Yet I remember as a very young Central Asian at the time being told that one of the people one had to look out for, this was in the early 80s, was a fellow called an ambitious, ruthless KGB officer called Vladimir Putin. Do you have any insight into anything he may have had to do with the Afghan war at the time in the 80s?
I don't. Do you? I don't. I mean, I know that he was, until he was, sent to train at the Red Banner Institute and then sent to Dresden as a spy, he was chasing dissidents and foreign tourists around Leningrad, which was not very glamorous work and is honestly kind of what he does all over the country now. But I don't know about his history in Afghanistan. I'm sorry.
Okay. I just mean that because somebody said that he was one of the, bigwigs behind the Palace massacre that killed Daoud and his family. So I just wondered, because that was a slaughter.
I don't think he was senior enough.
Okay.
Yeah.
But apparently his ideas or whatever, I don't know, but I just wondered. So thank you.
Thank you.
Julia, hi. Thank you so much for writing this book. I'm so stoked to read it, obsessed with the title and everything. Congrats on Pub Day.
By the way, another New York Times reporter.
I know, sorry. Are we disclosing?
Elizabeth Dias covers religion.
Oh, hi. I
extremely
recognize
talented
you.
religion.
My hair is very long now. Okay, so as I'm listening to this, I cover religion. I cover a lot about the conservative right. I think a lot about changing goals that different parts of America have for men and women. I was listening to someone at NatCon, the conservative conference, all these men everywhere. It was some panel about being a hero, and a young guy asked, "What can women do to make men better?" So as you are but I'm listening. I'm listening to you, and I'm like, oh my goodness, what are there resonances? But how do you think about what is similar and what is different over different time spans, in what you observed about women and how men treated them in Russia over this time? I don't know if you distinguish it in like there's sort of phases to how this goes. Can you say America and this certain movements in America are pushing us into X phase? Like, how do you process all of this?
That's a really good question. And yeah, again, can women do this other thing also for them? Like just add it to the list of things they have to do. Basically, I see it as the through line, at least in Russia. I haven't studied the US as much, but now that the book is done, I'm very much thinking about this same stuff. And my American readers were like, oh my God, this is scary, scary, scary. And the parallels are terrifying. But I see the through line as let's emancipate women because it's good for society, it's good for the economy, and I guess it's good for the women. And then once they're emancipated and they start doing well, and then they're half the workforce, and then they're more than half the workforce, and then they're half the college students, and then they're more than half the college students. It's like, let's emancipate them, but let's not go too far. Like, let's emancipate them, but how can they be emancipated while the men are still in charge? And if that balance starts to tip a little bit, the men freak out and some of the women freak out. And then it's like, all right, back we go. And we start, there are several points in the book and in Soviet history where there's a sense that the women are too strong and the men are getting left behind. And so the state has done too much for the women and needs to do more for the men. And the women need to chip in to help the men on top of everything else they're doing. I mean, there's this, in the excerpt that ran you just reminded me, in the excerpt that ran in the New Yorker about this Life Academy, this, this like woo-woo stuff about teaching women basically how to snare a man. And the woman who founded it wrote a book in 2015 called How to Make Your Man a Millionaire. Basically, how to channel your energies into the man so that he becomes the millionaire, and then you can stay home and not work. after you've done all the work to make him all the money. And he won't divorce you and like take all the money and run. But like, it's just infuriating. Yeah. I don't know. Like, but now I'm like, okay, now I want to dig into the American right because I'm seeing some of the same rhetoric.
So far, I'm not hearing much of a difference. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, no. So let's see what happens with domestic violence in America. Are they going to decriminalize it?
Yeah, I was thinking. Okay. Yeah.
And a lot of it is seen as like, God, the men have it hard enough. We're going to send them to jail for hitting their wives too. Come on.
Hello, thank you both so much for being here tonight. My name is Carolina, and I am an analyst at the Institute for the Study of War, so my full-time job is obsessing over the war in Ukraine. And my work specifically focuses on occupied Ukraine and the deportation of children. So my question for you has to do with Lvova Belova. I've been really fascinated with the way that she seems to kind of like weaponize traditional gender roles to further her career, and I know that's something that her predecessor did as well. But I was wondering if that was something that you came across in your research, and if you've kind of come across other examples of women who are higher up in the Kremlin hierarchy that have kind of used these traditional gender roles to further their careers and kind of play that long game with Putin.
You guys are the perfect audience. You just like, who planted the questions in the audience? Lvova Belova is a character in the book, as are the women cabinet ministers in Putin's government who...
Define her.
Maria Lvova Belova is the ombudswoman for children's rights. And she, along with Putin, is the only other person who has an ICC warrant out for her arrest for kidnapping Ukrainian children. She herself has adopted a young man from Mariupol, and she trots him around on stages around the country and says, "Look at my Ukrainian child," and he comes out and says, "She saved me," and it's super weird and icky. Again, it's all, so much of it is performative, and so much of it is about, this is what Vladimir Vladimirovich wants, this is where we're going in the country. In 2012, he gave that speech to the Federal Assembly and said, we're going to now focus on skrepa, the kind of the ties that bind, the traditionalist ties that bind Russian society and hold it up. And everybody else, everybody in the elite kind of got the signal and was like, got it, we're going in a traditionalist direction now. And her predecessor, I'm blanking on her name now, had...
Kuznetsova. Anna Kuznetsova?
Yeah, Kuznetsova, yeah. She had her 7th child while in the role, while in this job. She was married to a priest. She was very public and theatrical about all her children and her priest husband. Then she gets her friend, Maria Lvova Belova, hired for this job. She is also the wife of a priest. She has 24 children. I think 5 are biological. Then she adopted a few. Then she is the kind of the legal guardian of 13 or 14 others. And she's always just like, oh, я многодетная мать. It's like, I'm a woman with many kids, and that's just how we are. And while she's kidnapping Ukrainian children. While she's in office, though, she leaves her priest husband, strikes up an affair with Konstantin Malefeev, the Christian Orthodox oligarch who's sanctioned by the U.S. for funding the so-called separatists in eastern Ukraine, who is also big on traditionalism, traditional family values. They both leave their respective spouses for each other. And then you also have women like, Golikova, Olga Golikova, who is she's had a number of ministerial positions. She has no children of her own. She is, I think, twice divorced. And she now goes around the country telling young women that they should either delay or forego higher education to have children, which is not something she did. She chose, which is fine. Don't have kids. She focused on her career, fine. But she's going around telling young women at these government-sponsored youth conferences to be a stay-at-home mother of 17 kids instead. And then you have people in the legislative branch who were the face of I'm specifically thinking of 2 Duma members, 2 women who, Batalova and Mizulina, who were the face of decriminalizing domestic abuse. It wasn't men who said, hey, we need to decriminalize this. They said, hey, let's give our men a break. There were two women pushing for it and saying, this is for the traditional family. This is to keep the family together. So it's a very astute question, because this is Putin is very smart about this. He's not just telling, it's not just men telling women to do this. They have women telling them to do it too.
And is it your impression, Julia, that it's kind of a little bit, this whole sort of social project of kind of women staying home and having 17 children, like, is this a bit like pushing on an open door in terms of just like how Russians feel about it? It's not just like a project that Putin dreamed up and is forcing on everybody, right?
Yes and no. On one hand, as I describe in the book, women were exhausted by the Soviet project. They had been asked to do way too much, and they wanted to have the choice to not do some of those things. But because of all the traditionalist propaganda they'd gotten since World War II, and the Soviet Union needed a baby boom to, as Khrushchev said, replace the dead, they were like, the non-optional one is becoming a mother. So I'll do the mother thing, and if I can make the work, the professional part, optional, that's great. So there's been a yearning for that. And Putin has also played this role of this man that the average Russian woman never had. I talked to this one Russian pop star, and I was like, do you like him? She was like, girl, Putin is what 70% of Russian women see in their moistest fantasies.
Oh boy.
So yes, pushing on an open door. On the other hand, people also are voting with their feet, right? And Putin made 2024 the year of the family, and it was all about propaganda of families with lots and lots of kids. Многодетные семьи. Everywhere. He had a pageant where they would pick the family with a large number of children that was the best of these families. And this would all be televised, whatever. But that year, the birth rate plummeted. Russian women chose to have fewer kids than at any point since Vladimir Putin came to power.
Interesting.
So on one hand, there is some demand for this. On the other hand, because of the war, because of the economic instability, women are like, maybe not right now.
Thank you both.
Yes. This is the last question. Thanks.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It's been fascinating. I have a question about identity. So from the introduction, you came back to Russia in 2009, and it's been part of your life all these years. And this is kind of a bookend moment. You come out with this book. How has your identity evolved in relation to your Russianness over the course of these years? And with your parents being in the audience, how do they feel about that original trip back and you going back and being involved intellectually so much with the country that they decided to leave? Thank you.
That's a very good question. Thank you. My parents hated it. They hated it so very much, and they made sure to let me know. But they let me do it, and they let me study. We came here as refugees with not much, right? And not much is really overstating it. And then my parents take out these massive loans to send me to college, and I'm like, I'm going to study Soviet history. You wouldn't believe what Stalin said at the 25th Party Congress, right? And they're like, or not the 25th, whatever, he was dead by then. And they were like, you've got to be shitting me. And for me personally, it was, at school, I got, you ugly Russian bitch, go back to Russia, blah, 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 you're Russian. At home, I'm hearing you're not Russian, you're Jewish. Russian is an ethnic identity. And we're trying to be American. And when I would go back to Russia, people were like, God, you're so American. And then I come here and people are like, God, you're so Russian. And at some point I decided to stop trying to pick. And I said, yeah, I'm American and I'm Russian in the kind of national, not ethnic sense. And I'm also Jewish and I'm all of those things. And I don't have to pick. They all kind of exist together. And that's also what the book is about.
Thank you, everybody.
So copies of Julia's